Come join Melissa and her guests on the Chats from the Blog Cabin podcast. From North Carolina, this podcast will have you feeling like you've known these folks for years. Listen in as they chat about life, culture, current events, and more, all with a special Southern flair. Curl up with your favorite beverage and get ready to be entertained. Tune in now for a unique experience that's fun and insightful.
Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of Chats from the Blog Cabin. You know, the show where I virtually invite people into the blog cabin to chat about life. And today we are chatting about something very important that we all have is roots, and it's called Your Roots Cast a Shadow. Caroline's here and she wrote this book about her family, but I think it's going to actually make you guys want to investigate a little bit about your own families as well. So Caroline, welcome to the show. Before we start talking about the book, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me. And right now I'm really wishing that we were actually sitting by a lake because that intro was beautiful. So I currently live in Toronto. I'm Canadian. I was born in Sweden. And in 2013, I decided to sell almost everything I own and move to Poland with my husband. And I have done almost every job there is. I love to try new things. I've owned Pilates studio. I've danced. I have worked in real estate. I actually currently teach at an underground school for Afghan girls. Yeah. And yeah.
You do it all. You're a jack of all trades. Let's talk about the underground school for Afghan girls, because I think that's really interesting. I mean, I knew that happened, but I didn't know people actually, tell us about it.
Yeah, I mean, so it started because after I finished writing this book, I actually started on a second book, and I have a whole bunch of papers that my dad's father left. Stories from my dad's time in Afghanistan, from my family's time in Afghanistan, where my grandfather was tasked with building the road from Kabul to Jalalabad. And he left his about 38 pages of his story of his time there and Afghan folk tales. And when I saw them, I was like, okay, they're great, but I need someone who can help me understand them. And so I reached out to a friend of mine who works for Penn, and they put me in touch with an Afghan scholar who's living in Canada in exile. And so he and I just started talking, and he happens to run the school. And when I heard that, I thought, I need to be part of this. I need to help. We need to get these girls' voices out. We need to get these girls just communication with the outside world even. And so it just sort of started that way. And it's been amazing. Their stories are heartbreaking, but they're also amazing. And I'm doing my best to help them get published, to get their word out.
Wow, that is pretty awesome. I mean, I love that. And the fact that you're talking about this right now during Women's History Month in the United States and national, it's important that women's voices are heard.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And they're literally silenced, not even figuratively. These women they're not allowed to speak on the street. They're not allowed to go out at all. So yeah, it's it's so rewarding. I feel a little bit selfish saying that.
Yeah, well, it's rewarding because you're giving them the voice that they didn't have.
Yeah.
So it's not like selfish, like it's rewarding. I'm doing it because I want people to pat me on the back. It's rewarding because you are making a difference in somebody else's life. That's very important. So what made you decide to write Your Roots Cast a Shadow? Because, I mean, literally you went through there's so many stories in this book, so many.
I know. Well, I originally started writing this book when I was 19. That's when my mother passed away. And my dad and I would just walk and talk, and he would start telling me stories about my family and mostly her side of the family, just to reconnect to them. And it sort of started around then, and I knew it was something I had to do. And honestly, I just wasn't mature enough at the time to really delve into it and to really give it the importance it needed. And over the years, it was just something I kept coming back to slowly. And then it was only after I moved to Poland where I thought, no, this is a story that needs to be told. I need to tell my family's story because these stories are being forgotten. They're being erased. When we moved to Poland, they had a big change in their government, and the government started erasing history. And I thought that, this is something that can't continue. And also I realized that what I think we forget sometimes living over in North America is how interconnected we are. And
Mhm.
what's happening in Poland actually really matters to us. We just
Mhm.
don't know. And so I just started doing this, and I started collecting the stories and really delving in. And as I was writing, or as I was getting ready to pitch it, Russia invaded Ukraine, and I would see headlines, and I would jokingly say that they were ripping off my book, that they were plagiarizing my book. And of
Mhm.
different time, because the headlines were from the 1930s, not, it was a completely different time, different decade, and yet they were so similar.
Mhm.
So that sort of created that urgency for me to really get it done and pitch and hopefully get it published.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about erasing history, I think in the United States right now, people are trying to erase history. And it's
Yeah.
so sad because that's only how you learn from your mistakes is you look back at history.
Yeah, and we suck at it anyway. We're not great at learning from it regardless, so
Mhm.
erasing it just makes it that much worse.
Yeah. So when you moved to Poland, were you expecting to have the revelation and to be able to write this book? Or were you, as you were learning, and you were like, oh my gosh, I have to write this book now?
Yeah, the second. We moved because we were living in Vancouver, Canada at the time. It was great, but it just didn't. I would say it didn't feed my soul. I
Mhm.
needed more arts in my life. I needed the cobblestone streets. Although, funnily enough, we did live near a short cobblestone street. And then it was after I moved there, and it was completely unexpected. I don't know why no one told me, but we wound up moving onto a street that my family lived on after the war.
Mhm.
We wound up living right around the corner from where my dad lived. So when he came to visit, he was like, "Oh, I lived in this apartment building." We were living kitty corner to it. I lived around the bigger corner from where my parents got married, where my grandparents got married. Every day when I would go to take my ballet classes, I would walk by where my mother went to school, not too far. My father went to school. And it just sort of started coming alive for me in a way that I hadn't experienced before, because we're first generation immigrants to Canada.
Mhm.
So those roots just weren't here ever. I didn't have that history here. And when I started seeing it, when, just like kind of smack you in the face, this history that's right there, I thought, no, I just connected to them in a different way.
Yeah, I can see that because my husband's not American. He is a native of Mexico. And my son-in-law is Japanese. So we have the multicultural family, but I see where it's the importance of finding your roots and your history. I mean, how much research did you do for this book? I'm sure a lot of it was your conversations with your dad and living around the same places, but how much research did you really get into it?
So the research came because it was really important to me to not just to write a straightforward memoir, but to also include historical facts. I
Mhm.
thought that was really important because I think that we don't often make that correlation. And I thought I needed to have what was happening in the world and what my family
Mhm.
was reacting to. And so that was quite a lot of history. And I had to sit and wade through a lot of dates, a lot of dates, and a lot of, also when it got to be the wartime, a lot of very depressing and sad and
Mhm.
very heavy history, and not make it sound so heavy on the page, because that was one thing I didn't want. I didn't want people to sit down and just put the book down because it was too much.
Mhm.
So that was quite a bit of research. The actual family research was really funny because it was given to me. It was just handed to me on a silver platter. I have started genealogical research, but that's hitting a lot of dead ends just because of wartime records, Jewish records. A lot of
Mhm.
it doesn't exist. That could take years. My grandfather wrote a chronicle of events, and literally it's just a chronicle of his events, but the book is actually available at the Hoover Institute in Stanford, and a few other places have it. A few other museums have it. I think the Holocaust Museum has it as well, but it's just his book, which is like typewritten with where he's crossed it out. And so it took me a while for my Polish to be good enough to read it, because it's all in Polish, of course, nothing's translated. And I don't know why this man saved letters, but he did. And he saved a lot of letters that my mother wrote home while she was studying in Paris. And then when she lived in Baghdad with my father.
Mhm.
And so The harder part was deciphering their cursive writing in Polish. But all of that, I had it all. So then it was just going through the papers, figuring out the order, placing it on a very big timeline, and just starting to piece together what would have happened when. And my grandmother had done an interview before she died, so I was able to use that. Yeah. So
Wow.
it wasn't that difficult, but a lot of work.
A lot of work. Plus, too, you also had to navigate the divide in your family as well. Can we talk about that? Because that was a big part of the book.
Yeah, there are a lot of divides. I mean, I think, it's pretty normal in families to have these divides. So the really big one was with my father's family. I only saw his mother once in my life before she passed away. I was able to get fairly close, though, with my cousin, my dad's nephew, and then his daughters. So that was great. That was fantastic. And then my dad's brother, too. We managed to get close. He passed away not that long ago. So, and my dad had been repairing that relationship for quite a long time. But the main part of it stemmed because my dad decided to be loyal to my mother. I mean, that was it. Poland was demanding that my parents come back. This was the 1960s. This is actually a really big month as well in Poland. So in addition to International Women's Day, March 1968 saw some 30,000 Jews leave the country for a second time because they weren't wanted. And so that's when my grandfather was kicked out of the government, my mother's father. I usually refer to him as my grandfather, and because he was my grandfather my whole life. And so my dad and my mother were supposed to come back to Poland. My dad was working in Baghdad in Iraq at the time. But my mother knew that she would be arrested and they would have their passports taken away. And my dad simply said, I choose her. And his father stopped speaking to him. And I know he didn't speak to him till the day he died. I never knew that. I never knew my dad's father. And slowly he managed to find some bridge with his mother. But we grew up with just the one set of grandparents, really. There was the other side of the family wasn't really in the equation.
Yeah. Plus, too, your one member, I can't remember, correct me, your dad is Jewish?
Mom. It's from my
Your mom is Jewish, but your dad wasn't Jewish. So that had to be a divide as well, right?
Yeah, and I think maybe at first it wasn't. I don't know. This is something I'm exploring now, but it then became a divide. And my dad's family was definitely anti-Semitic. My dad's mother would throw digs at my mother and at my grandmother. And my dad was caught in the middle of it. Although my dad really adopted we are secular, but my dad really adopted all the traditions. So if we had any questions about Judaism, my dad was like the go-to person in the family for all these things. But yeah, it was unpleasant. It was definitely unpleasant at times. And there were some pretty nasty digs and things that got thrown out. And I know that when my mother's family was leaving Poland, my dad's family didn't stand up to help or say anything or stand up for them at all. So that definitely left those lasting impressions on the whole family.
Yeah, because they lived in pre-World War II Poland. Did they leave during the war or right before the war?
The Jewish side. So they actually left during. So what happened is, this is always the funny part. And I mean, I'm guilty of this too. Like I think, the war. So the war started and ended, but no, not exactly. The front moved and different parts were occupied at different times. So because my grandparents were actually in Lviv, which is now Lviv, Ukraine, but back then it was Poland. And so they actually were there till 1941. So they were there 2 years after the start of the war. And then they moved east and they went to Tashkent, Uzbekistan. And then by way of Moscow, they came back to Poland in 1944. And then they were in Poland from 1944, where my grandfather, he was in the government. And so he was known as the King of Coal at some point, and he was helping to literally rebuild the country. And then in 1968, the rumblings started again, and the government basically turned on them. And he was one of the first 3 ministers or vice ministers to members of parliament really to be kicked out. under the pretext that their kids were troublemakers, but they were all Jews. And then they were forced to leave. And actually, that was really interesting. When I was Googling around for that just to get more information, I found that hit the American newspapers. I think I found it in the Washington Post or something.
Wow.
Like some big papers were picked up on that.
Wow, that's really interesting. Was there one thing that you were surprised at when you were researching the book that you found and you were like, I did not know this?
You know, a lot of these stories were around, but I think there were a few little things. One that I didn't realize how much my grandfather did in Uzbekistan, like how much, because he was building canals there. And then actually my grandmother, the fact that at one point, my grandfather, he got very sick, he almost died, and she would go, and this was wartime, so people were starving, and she would go and she would donate blood in exchange for food and she helped him survive. So that was sort of amazing. I don't think she's given the credit ever for having done that. I think she was down to like 80 pounds or something. And then the fact that she was able to then walk into a medical school in Moscow and she sat down and she was like, I'm going to school now. You can't stop me. And she just stayed in school until they accepted her, which was sort of amazing. She was a woman, she was a Jew, and yet she managed to do that. And then actually the other grandmother, and again, stories I grew up with, and so I don't have maybe as much information as I would like, but the fact that when they were in Afghanistan, she would go to the market and she was determined to shop for her family. And the first time she went, the men threw rotten fruit at her and stones. And she went and she learned Farsi. And then she walked back in and she was the only woman allowed to trade with the men. And just like the nerve of these women. And then she was a gym teacher. She was in Afghanistan because she was a fairly high level tennis player, actually, before the war. And she went and she convinced the general to let the girls wear shorts to gym class. Unheard of, right?
Yeah. Wow. I can say they had both had gumption, didn't they?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. That's it. So those were the really amazing things for me.
Yeah, I remember reading the one about your grandmother and the donating the blood and stuff of your family. I'm like, man, I don't think I'm scared of needles. I don't think I could do that.
Yeah, I think, a lot of this was me reading between the lines of what my grandfather was writing. And I think a lot of this actually, it was just you had to do what you had to do to survive. And so I don't know that they were thinking past the next day or the next hour.
They were probably thinking let's just get us to this next meal. And then once that meal's done, then we'll worry about the other ones.
I think so.
So, I mean, when I was reading this book, I was like, wow, there's so much history in here. I love the fact, like you said, you added in the historical, what was going on at the time, but just your family and the letters that your mom sent back from Paris. I'm like, too bad she didn't have an iPhone, because when she needed something, it would take her forever to get, her parents, your grandparents would send her food and it'd be rotten by the time it got there. And I'm like,
I know. And then she'd get annoyed at them because she was like, if I really want it, I can go get it. So yeah, I know. I'm really shocked that my grandfather kept those letters and then that my mother kept them. I actually wound up saving those letters from a flood. The basement where my dad was keeping them had flooded, and I wound up finding them and saving them. So, but yeah, the fact that they had somebody decided to keep these letters. I mean, thank you. I appreciate it. Made my work a lot easier.
I love that. So you have an excerpt that you're going to read from your book?
Sure. All right. So I have a choice. It can be the slightly lighter one when I arrive in Poland, or the heavier one.
You can read both of them if you want.
Okay. So we'll start with the lighter one. This is right after my husband and I arrived in Poland. It's from chapter 3, and it's called Assimilation or Not by Way of Food. I'm standing in the middle of the street crying. I hate this coffee. Why does everything taste so weird? Why is surówka served with everything? To this day, I don't get what's to love about a type of coleslaw. Why did we come here? What was I thinking? My poor husband stands helpless watching my meltdown. He later tells me he was concerned by my extreme reaction and worried I was going to unravel. He felt bad, he said. He had no idea how to help me. We haven't found our support system. For now, it's just the two of us trying to navigate our daily existence. The honeymoon period in a new place lasts about a month. That's when everything feels new and shiny before your new reality takes you by surprise. I have to wonder, is this how my parents felt when they first lived in Baghdad or Paris, in Sweden or Toronto? No wonder they didn't hang on to the foods they knew or to the traditions. How could they? They learned it was easier to adapt than to blindly cling to old conventions. My father grew up in post-war Poland when food was heavily rationed. For years, my parents had to be financially creative to put healthy meals on the table. Food was the bridge to our life in Canada and all the places my parents called home. Adjusting to our new life in Poland is demanding. Having breakfast at Vincent's, a Parisian cafe in the heart of the city, helps, and in a couple of days we fall into a routine that leads us daily to this tiny piece of Paris, complete with flags, those iconic wicker chairs, and the best baguettes outside of France. Each morning we leave our flat for a small park with sweeping views of Powiśle, an indie neighborhood bordering the Vistula River and the escarpment where we live. There are always lots of people walking dogs off leash, so we pick our way through dog poop and garbage left by partygoers, local drunks, and students. Pristine the park is not, but we have a prime view of the church grounds, one of the many, many churches in Warsaw, and a view of the river and the rooftops. Walking down a steep hill where kids toboggan in the winter, we come to the Chopin University of Music, where we're serenaded by students practicing the piano or violin, or occasionally a flute, creating that alluring cacophony heard at the start of a classical concert. Then make our way up to Nowy Świat, a part of the royal route. This daily walk to Vincent's makes us happy. The general societal mood is electric, despite a certain heaviness that lingers. Warsaw is a city that displays its memories, especially those that contrast starkly with the modern world. Memorials and statues stand out on prominent streets. Buildings show off shell holes from World War II assaults. Every few steps, there is a plaque commemorating a death or a war event, like the beautiful old library around the corner from our home that saw its books burned during the Nazi regime. Even with history at every turn, the pink, blue, and yellow buildings perk up the gray, wintry feel of Warsaw. Pixie, our Cairn Terrier, with her laid-back West Coast disposition, putters along at our side as we pass restaurants and cafes that will soon be bustling. Pixie loves Vincent's as much as we do. Why wouldn't she? Those owner hand feeds her fresh croissants, sometimes with jam. Those croissants are the best part of our mornings. Breakfast breaking apart the buttery flakes, each bite a delectable morsel, and washing them down with rich cappuccinos is the only sane way to start the day. Actually, there are 3 Parisian cafes to choose from on this street, each with its own flavor. Petit à Petit has vintage French music, and each baguette is named after a different city. A few meters away is Croque Madame with whitewashed walls and bunches of lavender strategically displayed. Vincent's is my favorite because it reminds me the most of Paris, but each cafe is filled with the aroma of fresh bread. From flaky pastries to cream-filled macarons to warm, melt-in-your-mouth pain au chocolat to delicate madeleine, every day brings some new indulgence. In the weeks to come, when we finally rejoin society, we will drop by Vincent's on Saturday mornings to pick up a freshly baked baguette that is still warm to the touch, to pair with runny cheeses, fragrant meats, juicy red tomatoes, and crisp pickles. This is the meal that grounds us, that makes us feel we are home. For now, walking to Faux Paris every morning is our escape from the obvious. At some point, we will have to find work. At some point, we will have to eat healthier food. That means I will have to cope with grocery shopping.
I love that, cope with grocery shopping. I mean, what person does not, like, they could not identify with that, because coping with it, I hate going to the grocery store.
I hate it here, and it was even worse when I didn't understand the food.
I can imagine. So now you have a more darker one as well?
Sure. It's not very dark. It's just the other part of that first experience.
Yeah. I think that's important, that people not only see the highlights, but also the other stuff that people are grappling with as well.
Absolutely. All right. This is This is like within that same time frame, and it was just the different aspects of what we were feeling and experiencing when we arrived. So this is chapter 5, and it's choinki and menorahs, a clash of holidays in Warsaw. And a choinka is a Christmas tree. I just happen to really like the way it sounds and is spelled in Polish, so I left it in Polish. That was the other thing I really wanted to include, like the actual words, and let people see the language a little bit too.
Yeah.
Hanukkah comes early in 2013, starting on November 27th. Most of our things are still in boxes somewhere on the ocean. It's at this moment that it hits me. Where do I buy a menorah and candles in a Catholic country? In Toronto or Vancouver, it was easy, but in Poland? I finally realized that the only place to find a menorah and candles is in the general store next to the Nożyk Synagogue on Twarda Street, in what was once the Jewish part of town. Entering the courtyard, I feel the same way I do when I first see the boundary marker embedded on the sidewalk on Świętokrzyska, depicting the wall where the Jewish ghetto once stood. The friend I'm walking with, a longtime resident of Warsaw, admits it is the first time she has noticed the marker. I don't say anything, but I want to yell out at everyone mindlessly stepping over the metal plaque. Do you know what you just walked over? Do you know what happened here? How can you go about your day and ignore history? At least take a second to acknowledge it. This isn't about religion. It's more about humanity. I'm frustrated. I'm terrified that this is ignored. Why isn't more being done to educate the public? I know that there is a good chance that the Holocaust will be forgotten in the near future, and that will be dangerous for the entire world. I feel paralyzed with my thinking, and I'm not entirely sure what I can do to relay my fears to anyone who will listen. A uniformed soldier cradling a large gun stands out front. This is a very common sight around most European synagogues. The main synagogue in Berlin stands behind a 10-foot fence. The main synagogue in Florence has concrete barricades spanning a 6-foot perimeter around the entrance. Paris, Prague, Venice. If the city even has a synagogue, then it's most likely behind some sort of wall populated with armed guards. Churches, on the other hand, are easily accessible with doors that are open to the public. We approach a man sitting behind a large glass wall. What do you want? Why are you here? Are you Jewish? I say that I am, and my husband is not. We have to hand over our passports, and with much skepticism, he allows us finally to enter. I am more welcome in the general store. When the man behind the counter learns I'm in the market for a menorah, he's thrilled to show me everything they have. I also buy some candles and a few other treats that will get us through the holidays. After we leave, he tells me that I'm always welcome. He says a few words in Hebrew. I smile and mumble something. I hope he doesn't guess that I have no idea what he said.
I love that. I love the fact that you are learning about your culture as well when you're over there in Poland, that you were learning, that even though Poland is, you said it was a Catholic country, there's a lot of Jewish people there. And the fact that the faith and the synagogues, and there's still so much hatred in the Holocaust and people not believe. There are some people that even think that it never happened. I'm like, come on, people.
I know. And, it used to be the hub of Jewish life in Europe, like Poland into Lithuania into like all the surrounding countries. That was Jewish life. And now it's a Catholic country, and very much so. So much so that when you walk into those areas, yeah, they're guarded. It's not just, you can feel it. There's a change, definitely. And so it was interesting for me because suddenly I was meeting people who I'm pretty sure I was the first Jewish person that they ever met, like that they knew that they met. And people would be surprised, which to me was shocking. I grew up in Toronto, it's a big city. And so, yeah, it was very strange for me too. And I definitely connected a lot more with my roots because of that.
Was it a culture shock too, as well, coming from Toronto to going to this place where you already said the food was already trying to figure out going grocery shopping and trying to figure out what food was what?
It was for me, definitely. I grew up speaking Polish, but I grew up speaking that home Polish where you're throwing in English words. It's a little off. So going there, 100%. Plus, for the first time, I live in Toronto, right? And a lot of us here in North America, you live in a big city. There are a lot of people, a lot of accents. Like, it feels like everybody has an accent.
Mm-hmm.
But there, I was one of the few people that had an accent. So suddenly people were stopping and wondering where, what, why, how. That I have this accent, but I can speak the language and what's going on here, and they couldn't understand it. And then there were a lot of customs that just were really foreign to me that I had no idea about, just things you don't even think about. Just, I wrote about those like social norms about how the men won't exit the elevator, and like, as a woman, if you're standing in the back, suddenly you're like working your way through the elevator to get out because the guys don't want to walk out of the elevator. Just these really, to me, they were strange. They were different.
Yeah. So what's the biggest thing you learned about yourself while you're writing this? Because I know you probably learned some lessons.
Good question. That's hard. That's always such a hard question. I think what a certain level of activism really woke up in me when I started connecting with my grandparents, my parents, and seeing what they went through and what they did. These aren't things they talked about. Really, these aren't things I never understood just how important it was what they did. And I realized that I want to follow in that. That's why I teach the Afghan girls. That's why now I start to want to write, I'm working on a second book that has to do with these things. That I'm starting to go to more protests and things, just to really not just let life pass by. I really want to be actively involved, like headfirst.
You want to make a difference with your life like your parents did.
I do. I think that was very commendable of them. And I feel like they started something, and I want to keep it going.
So was there one thing that when you were writing this book, you were like, I can't put this in, or you fought to keep it in?
There was. So you're the first person who's asked me that. It's good. It's good. It's about my grandfather. And there was a line when he was young, and he would hang out with the boys from the more religious Hebrew school. And it was the lines of people telling the Jews to go back to Palestine. And there were a few lines like that there about like the very racial slurs and all of that. And I was like, I will cut so much more, but I'm leaving that in because, and especially now, I'm glad I left them in. But those were a few of the lines that I said that I refused to let that go. Most of the time I'm a pretty good author to work with because I don't become too attached, but that was definitely one part that was going to stay.
You were like, I need that to stay because this is actually something that still applies to today.
Yeah. And it will apply, again and again. That's like evergreen. Unfortunately, it's evergreen content. Yeah.
I can't even imagine how much research, how long did it take you to write this book? Because there's a lot of research and there's a lot of storytelling in this book too.
So the first version of this book was very different, and it was just very light with like little family stories, little quirky things. And it was because I had a blog, and it was sort of in that vein, the whole blogger thing. And I started to pitch it, and and they were saying, those stories are more interesting than the light, fluffy stuff that you have. And I thought, you know what? I think they're right. I think I need to go back over this. And so I actually found my mentor at a writing festival, and I basically stalked her. Don't recommend it. We laugh about that now, and it was really funny. I found out I met her about 3 or 4 hours away from where we lived, and then I found out she lived around the corner from me. So it was meant to be, right? It was meant to be. And with her help, it took probably about 2 years of solid back and forth writing. And then the last bit was written. This book was accepted for publication. From the time it was accepted to the time it was published was actually very short. Never happens. It was 9 months. And within that time, they just threw edits at me. So I actually wrote quite a bit more in that process, but about 2 years, I would say.
Wow, I can't even imagine going through the process and you're pouring your heart and soul into it, and then you hand it over to somebody else, and then they just mark it up and they take It's like they're ripping your heart out. How did you go through that process? How did you, like you said, you fought to keep the slurs in, you fought to keep some other stuff in. How did you go about, like, okay, this isn't worth fighting for, but this is worth fighting for?
So, I mean, I'm an editor myself and I run a small press and do all that. So I'm constantly the one yelling at people too. So I kind of get it. But actually my editor at HCI, she was amazing. And I have to say, like, we just connected right away. And the fact that, I had a lot of rejections for this book. A lot of people would not touch it, did not want to work with it. Memoir is hard to sell. I heard all of it. And she was just phenomenal, and she loved it and she championed it. And I think when you find that person who's championing it, that what they're saying and doing is just to make it better. And they're looking at it with a more critical eye, the eye that I can't see anymore, because I couldn't tell at some point. The funny thing is that she cut a little bit, but really we probably added close to 10,000 words. Because she was like, I want more details. I want more. So it was almost the reverse. I really didn't have to fight her very much. And at the end, when we were getting down to that last little bit and we had somebody else looking at it as well, there were like 2 moments where I was like, okay, fine. Like, yeah, okay, we can cut this, or I really want to leave this, but let me explain it a little bit more. But it wasn't that bad.
Good.
Yeah. We had a really good connection. And I think that's the one thing that people forget sometimes too, is that the editors they really want it to be good. Their name is on it too. So, she's thanked in my acknowledgments. So I'm publicly outing her too.
I love that you're publicly outing her. But that's so important that you have an editor that you believe in and that believes in you, because if you get one that just like wants to slash everything, or you need to rewrite this whole book and hands it back to you, you're like, no,
exactly. That's the thing. You have to understand, like, if an editor is somebody, you have to trust them for sure. There's like little things you can fight for. Absolutely. They're expecting that too. But we were changing around the order of this book right up until the last moment before it went to publication.
Now, what did you think when you held the book in your hand? Did you think, wow, this is, first of all, it's not a quick read, I will say that. I mean, because there's so many stories in there, but it's a interesting read though, because you're taking what's happening in the world that you've only heard about, like history books and everything, and adding your personal stories to it that makes it become more real for people. They're like, oh, it's not just something that happened so many years ago. This is actually happening to real people in real time. Even now today, you can take some of the stories that you apply. What did you feel like when you had this book? Did you think it was going to make the impact that it made?
No. I think, the process is really funny because it's exciting and it's also exhausting. And by the time it's going to publication, there's this part of you that is so tired of it because all you've been doing is living and breathing this book. And then you start thinking about the marketing part of it, which is this extra component. And you're like, I can't barely look at it. But then I was by myself at home. It's online, my unboxing video. And I was sitting at home and this box gets dropped off and I had no idea what it was. So I just opened it and I was like, look, it's my book. And I was like completely by myself. And it was this weird, like non-eventful moment. But then it started to be really cool. And actually the best part is now hearing you telling me that it was impactful and that it is, and hopefully it does make people look at their family histories. That was the whole point of writing this, is that we can, those stories that connect us. But and just hearing that and getting people's feedback, this is the cool part. This is the best part now, because now I hear that people are really, it's making an impact. I had a friend text me this morning. She's like, I finally finished your book. And I was like, yay. And then I had to be can you leave me a review, please? Because then you're asking for reviews. So you have like that whole component, which is really hard to do. But I asked, and then she said, she's like, so many things, that last line, so many things, we need to talk. Great. That's what I wanted. That's
the conversation. And the thing is, you did a lot of this. A lot of these were stories that you heard in childhood, but all the research was after your parents were gone, correct? Close to it.
My mother, yes. My father actually died in June of 2024, so he never saw the book in completion. I was collecting some last stories from him till like the last minute that I could. But yeah, everybody else was pretty much at this point. It was just my working with my memories, seeing where my dad could fill in some blanks. But yes, like the next book that I'm working on, I'm actually going completely blind now into it because it's gone. I did have the foresight, I don't know, to record the conversations. So they're like, now it's so hard to listen to them, but I did record. And actually there was one detail, and it was a really bizarre detail. It was, which passports did my dad's parents hold after the war? What was the passport? Because there was something my dad said and it just didn't add up, and I had a recording of him saying it, so I knew he had said it, but something wasn't adding up with what it was, and somebody caught this detail, and I wound up having to call my cousins in Poland, and then my husband contacted his dad, because they're Polish as well, to say, like, what could this passport be? And we had to like piece it out because we couldn't even find it online.
Wow.
So
I applaud you for having the foresight to record. I wish I had done that with my dad, because my dad was a storyteller in our family, and he could tell you, like, off the top of his head, like XYZ about some aunt, some uncle, all this other stuff. And unfortunately, he passed in 2015. So I know how much it means to you to hear your dad's voice on those tapes, but also how much it hurts to hear your dad's voice knowing that he's not with you. So I applaud you for knowing that you needed it for research, but also knowing that in the long run, it was going to actually be something that you could treasure forever too, as well.
Yeah. So they're sitting in the cloud.
Yeah, but hopefully the cloud doesn't get hacked.
Yeah, I know. Seriously. It's okay. I have them like 5 places.
There you go. That's good. So what do you want people to learn from the book? I mean, obviously we need to definitely invest in our elders, because they're the ones with the stories, and we need to sit down and have conversations with them and write things down and do things. But what else do you want people to learn?
So that, 100% do that. Also save some of the things. You know, we have one photo album that was left over from Afghanistan. The pictures are like 1 inch, some of them tiny, like you can barely make them out. Most of it, the stuff was confiscated, but I do have some bits of my grandfather working on this road in Afghanistan, which is amazing. Actually, a lot of the family things from Afghanistan are in a museum right now in Poland. But keep that. I would say also record your parents when you can, even if you think these stories are not important. They are. And especially this would happen to me all the time. Why do you want to record this? I have nothing to say. I don't know what I have. Nothing's ever happened. Who's going to care? And that happened quite a bit. And I would be like, okay, that's fine. We don't have to. And I'd still have I'd slip and most of the time I was recording on my phone by the end. So I just turn my phone on, hit the record button, and I would just let them talk. And I had one time with my uncle where he talked for 4 hours. By the end, I was like, I have to stop. I can't do this anymore. So it's that. And it's also to really find out about our roots, because the only way we can all move forward, and the only way we can find connections with each other, is sort of if we know our stories. And I think what happens too is we forget to listen. And so, but there's no way for us to move forward. And I think most of us have more in common than we know.
Yeah.
And that we realize. And if anything, it would be that, to listen to other people's stories and try to find those common threads so that we can strengthen them. Because otherwise, I don't know, there's just no, it's just going to, it's so divided now anyway, right? Our worlds, our countries, all of them, they're so divided. But that's the way we find those connections. That's the way we find that humanity in other people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I wish now that I had asked my dad more questions about the way he was brought up, and the way, how his grandmother was from Canada and his grandfather was from Michigan. So I'm like, how did they get together and how did they move to Massachusetts? Because that's where my dad was born. So I don't understand all that, but now it's lost. Nobody knows in the family anymore how they got together. And it's like, it's important to know the story so that you can pass them down to other kids. I mean, I'm proud that I can trace my ancestry back to my great grandmother being from Canada, and my girls can trace back theirs. Their dad's from Mexico. So they already have where they know there's immigrants. And that's why I think it's important that we support immigrants and their stories too, because they built our countries.
Yeah, 100%. And everybody, to somewhere far back down the line, everybody's an immigrant. And I think that, and that's that, and we forget that. We absolutely forget that in everyday life. And there's a lot of really ugly things being said now, but I'm a first generation immigrant. I stood before that judge and heard "Welcome to Canada," so I know what that's like. So that's. But yet, people don't never guess by looking at me or listening to me. Nobody can guess that I'm a first generation immigrant myself. So I think that's what we forget. People come for a reason. They're coming because, yes, they may be escaping something, but they're also coming to help build something, to help make something better, to contribute. My dad was an engineer. A lot of Toronto, when you walk around, I would walk around with my dad as a kid. He'd be like, that's my building, and that's my building, and that's my building. So this is like literal building of the city. And all of our parents contributed in some way, no matter what they did.
For sure.
So, yeah.
So our time is almost up. Is there any last little, I hate that it's almost up, but is there any last little nugget that you want to share that maybe we've hit on that you want to reiterate, or something we didn't hit on that you want to share? Put you on the spot there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just that idea not to be afraid to find these things. And also to know too that there, I'm thinking about what you said about your family and how those stories are lost. But I bet there are records. I bet there are marriage records and birth records. And I bet with a little bit of research, you can trace your family and see where they went. And they obviously are a part of US history. And so I think that it's not to be intimidated by the work. I find the actual work usually isn't the hard part. It's the emotional part that's hard. So I would just tell people, like, just not to be afraid of that emotional part, because yes, you will cry. That's okay. There are a lot of tears shed writing this book, but it's that idea of just finding that out, because you just don't know what you might find. And I think that's also the exciting part.
So that brings me to the question, because I know a lot of the listeners and the viewers are going to want to know, how do you get started researching that stuff?
For me, it was pretty simple. I just started with ancestry.com, actually. Most of my records are in Europe because, like I said, I don't have a history here. If somebody is looking for overseas, don't go with the local. I'm so sorry. Do not go with local people, because they're going to charge you a whole lot more. Like, I found a genealogy place in Poland, in Warsaw, Poland. They speak English. They write in English. All our communication was in English. Fraction of the price, and they're on the ground, so they can find information for you. So I would start that way. But a lot of these sites, like Ancestry, really is good too, especially for the US and Canada, to just start looking that up, just start Googling it. And then there are sites like newspaper.com, which, if you are in the States or Canada, they actually have great resources. It's through there that I found things about my grandfather too. So, and he was never really in the States. So sites like that are really good. JSTOR is another one that's really great, that has a lot of really good resources. Libraries will have it too. Some of them are paid, some of them are free, these resources, but then good old Google, because I literally typed my grandfather's name into Google just to see what would happen. And that's how I found out that his book was at the Hoover Institute, of all places.
Wow.
They have no idea how they got it.
There's got to be records somewhere of how they got it.
Well, I spoke to the lead researcher, and so and I know it's somewhere, it's in another museum or Holocaust museum or something in somewhere in Europe. And I think a lot of them share information. And so I think that's how these things travel. But she said she would look into it too, because she wasn't sure how they got it. So it like really just simple Google searches to start. And then all these other places will open up and you'll start finding them.
Wow. You left us with a lot. I wrote down all the places that you talked about so I can put them in the show notes, because I think it's important that if your parents are still alive, to have conversations with them, to learn about where they came from and about maybe some of the ancestors they may have. I had an aunt that was really big into going through and doing ancestry, but she's also passed too. But I think it's very important that we learn where we came from. And once we trace back our roots, we realize that maybe some of the stances that the world is taking on immigrants maybe should not be the stances, because we all, like you said, were immigrants at one time. We are all descended from immigrants, so they should not take that stance. I thank you for writing this book, and when your second book comes out, I want to read it because I want to see how you do it. And you're welcome to come back on and talk about the second book, because I feel like this has opened up a whole new can of worms for me now that, one, I have regrets because not knowing the stories. But now, too, I have more of a fever to actually learn more about, where I came from, and learn more about my husband's side of the family, too, as well.
Absolutely. See, it's that's the best part of writing the book. Thank you.
So tell people where they can find you at.
So I'm very easy to find. If you Google Caroline Topperman, you will find me. That's me. And so on social media, I'm Caroline Topperman pretty much across the board. And my website is carolinetopperman.com. So it's not too hard.
And your book is Your Roots Cast a Shadow. I put the Amazon link because most people have Amazon. Absolutely. If you read the book, leave a review.
Please. Thank you. That's the best thing you can do for an author.
So, Caroline, thank you for coming on and for sharing your story and your family with us, because I felt like I got to know your family as I was reading this book as well.
Thank you for having me. This was a really fun conversation.
So, guys, I will share in the show notes where you can find Caroline, as well as some of the places that she talked about, as well as where to find the book. And until next time, keep chatting. Bye.